I would like to introduce Professor Carl-Ulrik Schierup, who is a professor emeritus at the Institute for Research on Migration, Ethnicity and Society, otherwise known as Realsozialismus, at Linköping University, where he was a director of Remesso from 2008 till 2017. In his research, he brings together political economy with sociology and social anthropology in studies of migration, globalization, precarization of labor, social movements, and global governance. And recently, he's been focusing on urban grassroots movement. I also think that he has a long list of publications, so let me just mention the last edited volume, Migration, Civil Society and Global Governance, which is much connected to the topic of our conference today, or the other edited volume, Migration, Precarity and Global Governance, Challenges and Opportunities for Labor from 2015. So let me welcome you, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation to come. I feel quite at home here. It feels like really a sister institute to our Remesso with its critical and holistic approach to migration. As you may have spotted from the introduction, I'm sort of I wouldn't call it an amateur of everything and a master of nothing. Done a lot of things in my life from the early 70s until today on these issues that we are discussing. But maybe that doing a little of everything is good when you have the task of chairing an institute. So the real specialist, one of them on the issues of global governance is really Stefan, and I'm happy that he's coming after me so he can correct all the blunders. Anyway, so you probably have heard about the Global Compact for so-called safe, orderly and regular migration. This is a very indicative sort of title of it. It was passed by most governments in December last year, and in this book that came out this year, we are referring a group of authors to the compact, and sort of trying to answer this very tricky question posed by Lex Riffel in a Brookings blog. Was this or is this a milestone in the governance of migration, or is it dead on arrival? And many think that the latter is the case, actually. Towards the end of the lecture, I'll try to make a provisionary answer to offer a provisionary answer of that. We were a group of researchers. It was a research consortium from Remesso, Sweden, and Ankara University and the University of Zacatecas in Mexico, who did a joint project on the whole process that led up to a long process led up to the Global Compact. And the book is discussing that process from different angles. There are also researchers from South Africa, from Singapore, and then Stefan, not to forget, from Prague University. He's in the book, and somebody from the US. Let's see. Before, as I promised, I was a bit. I was not very careful doing that, but it should have maybe been 2 lectures to connect the issue of these three issues like migration, precarity, and global governance. And just some premises for what I'm going to speak about and argue. I mean, the first thing is most migration is forced due to certain criteria and not free. It's not simply about refugee migration, etc. It's a more general argument that we actually, especially my colleague Carl-Ulrik from Mexico, makes in the book. But another sort of premise is that migration should be studied as an integral feature of social transformation. And with social transformation is Stephen Carstens, who's a Nestor in migration research, actually refers to the neoliberal transformation of economy and society has been taking place, going on for the last, I think it's 4 decades now, actually from the end of the 1970s. Maybe it's coming close to a breaking point now. And then there's the axiom that migrants are valuable because they are vulnerable. That's a special value of migrant labor. And that's an argument made by Harold Boder in Canada, who's not very lyric about the Canadian migrant sort of migratory system and about migrants and descendants in Canada, actually. And then the argument by Standing that migrants are the core of a new global precariat. What is precarity? It's sort of a constitutive element of the new global disorder, according to this quite emphatic argument. And it's not a mistake, it's very functional to that order. And it's reaping a free rent, that's it. Come back to that. And it's operating only in the present but exploiting also the future. I would say also the past, and it's coming close to this argument about the reproduction of labor and family and so on that Eleonore referred to or elaborated in her very inspiring lecture. And it refers, I mean, the notion of precarity to a life world characterized by uncertainty and insecurity. I mean, think about the gig economy, which is kind of epitomizing precarity today. But it's also double-edged. It implies both a condition, a social condition, an economic condition, etc., but it's also a possible rallying point for resistance or for social movements. And that is an argument I'm trying to make in what comes later about the primacy of transversal alliances between different movements of different sort of orientations in counter-hegemonic struggles going on, for example, around the Global Compact. So this is about the picture is Mexican workers in the U.S. who are actually modifying an argument that was made in Britain by Sivanandan and others, that we are here because you were there. I mean, that's a colonial thing. We are in Britain as exploited labor, etc., and second-rate citizens because you were there as colonialists. But they say you are there, and they refer to NAFTA and the things that actually crushed the Mexican peasant economy and also didn't live up to the promises about a new grand economic area of industrialization in Mexico. And so it's about this great transformation. I mean, I'm just pointing to a lot here randomly to a lot of different elements of it, the grand neoliberal transformation. So somebody who's a famous guy who has tried to organize this or embed this in a powerful metaphor is David Harvey, who speaks about accumulation by dispossession. And it's about all that has been going on in different phases since actually the beginning, mostly of the 1980s, with the debt crisis and that crushed economies in many developmental states, like, for example, Mexico, but also where I've done my fieldwork and studies, former Yugoslavia, and spawned enormous waves of precarious migration. It's about a massive, you could say, both a commodification of labor, if you speak about rural economies, but also re-commodification of labor, if you speak about the welfare states and the urban sectors of developmental states, about austerity packages, privatization, grabbing of the commons. The commons both as common land, that is in the peasant economies, but also the common state, our common sort of property that is protecting us against hyper-exploitation. Okay, I won't go into details here, but go on to this idea of the precariat, like Standing says that argues that migrants are the core of a much bigger sort of a precariat, and they, again, border, they are so valuable because they are extra vulnerable. And why are they so extra vulnerable? Because they are channeled into the most insecure, I mean, large degree, not all migrants, of course, the most disadvantaged sectors of segmented labor markets, ethnically and racially racialized labor markets, and with an unequal structuration of risk, there's a lack of protection and security. It's about what we could call hyper-exploitation. It's an exploitation in the present, but exploiting also the future, and could even argue the past. But it's about, I mean, citizenship is a very important instrument for exclusion and inclusion actually sorting migrants into different categories according to their different statuses and so on. This exclusion is variable. It pertains to both civil society, social and political citizenship. It pertains to different categories in what is somehow we call mixed migration, but illegalized and undocumented or irregular, depending on which term we prefer. It's about temporary workers, it's about asylum seekers, but also racialized minorities that maybe have formal rights but not enjoy substantial rights. So, but there's a development in this in the course of the neoliberal process of the transformation. I mean, at some states, as we argue also in the book, irregular migration was very important, undocumented migration for the economies of the north, but also in not many other places like South Africa or Singapore or whatever you think, Nigeria that exploits labor from neighboring sort of poorer parts of Africa and whatnot, Libya. It's a situation of deregulation, where deregulation is going on, but it's not of protective institutions in different parts of the world. But only, but there's still this framework of law that is active. So in order to circumvent the rules, the regulations, and the informalization and is so important. But the tendency in a more mature states of the neoliberal transformation is going towards managed migration, which is kind of an integrated element of neoliberal re-regulation for the economy and society to as far as possible using the market principles as regulatory instruments. So this managed migration tends to be more stringently monitored than possibly, the old guest worker system in Central Europe. Casarino has called it securitized temporariness. It's going together with a draconic securitization of both the borders and the inner territories. And some have talked about this globalized apartheid, and because citizenship has actually a double function. Partly, locking in different parts of the global labor market into these national boxes, and then so that in this case of temporariness, the reproduction of the family of labor will partly take place in the regions of origin, and then the border and the kind of grading of citizenship on a global scale. That's the argument of Stephen Castles is very important. But then towards the inside, it's about what rights you get once you have become an immigrant. I think that's an important thing. It goes sort of all together. I've been speculated about that. About the a kind of collusion between the neoliberalism and its sort of elites, and the new populism, extreme right populism. It's sort of capital gets what it needs in terms of cheap labor. It might not always be ideal. Some people are more useful if they have full citizenship for some factions of, some employers, but anyway. But at the same time, the populists or the extreme right is sort of getting a guarantee that these people will never become citizens. They're circulating or they are temporary. So, and they don't have the same rights, as we also heard this morning. Especially, at least in terms of social protection, about labor rights, about care work, whatever. So, I took this. Maybe it's not so typical, but it just shows how important migration is and how complex the structuration of migration and this, not least this temporary migration is relating to leading corporations in the world. It's about Apple and how our iPhones are actually produced and the circulation of labor value in that production process. And it involves Mexican so-called cerebreros. It's paraphrasing the Braceros concept. It's about people who work with their brains, and it's about brain drain, and it's becoming more and more, especially under Trump, structured as temporary migration of brain workers. And then you have, and that's where it's not so typical about China. Most of these phones and all that stuff is produced in China, and the leading producer in the world is Foxconn, a gigantic company that produces so most of these things on a world basis, and they employ 1 million of these rural urban workers in China, extremely exploited workforce of young people mainly that are worn out like disposable goods in quite a short time, and living under very much the same conditions, also because of their inner, there's an inner sort of borders in terms of citizens. They don't have citizenship where they work, and it's much functioning like the old apartheid system in South Africa. I mean, reproduction of the labor in the rural areas, partly. So, but also there's another factor that is, if you look at the products that are going into an iPhone, one extremely important one is platinum, and South Africa is the world's largest prime exporter of platinum, and the working conditions in the platinum mines are appalling, and so much of the work is done by migrant labor. And I cannot go into this, but it's in a system that is not exactly the same as on the apartheid, but it's no less exploitative. So it's kind of this circle, anyway. And Apple has a profit margin or operation margin of 30%, but Foxconn has only 2%. It's a Taiwanese company organizing production in China. And it just presses its workers all the time, so they jump out and commit suicide from these large buildings. But the more workers they employ, the more the profit rate is falling. So it's about this disorganic development that also in the new global economy. So what we are, I mean, there's making or building a global governance regime is obviously confronted with vast corporate interests, and also cooperation, collusion of state and capital in the organization of this process. The Apple is just one of hundreds. And then the question is, what is actually, under these conditions, what is the actual space of action and influence for migrant organizations and their partners like unions and civil society advocacy organizations under these conditions? But very much is at stake in the global economy and in terms of corporate interests. But and then we ask in the book, what are the terms and prospects or participated in what we call invited spaces, international intergovernmental deliberations, in forging global governance regime of migration. So one central couple of terms, twin terms we use in the book is invited versus invented spaces. And then, I mean, invited spaces about it's about the importance of engaging civil society as both a legitimating partner and a service providers in neoliberal governance. It has been discussed by in important works by these people up there. And we could shortly define invited spaces as those that invite CSOs and as a civil society organizers into stakeholder dialogues on important topics like the one we are discussing. And these spaces are occupied by organizations that are actually legitimized by donors and government interventions. They are screened, they are selected, they are controlled. And there is a strong risk, according to these different studies, of this participation legitimizing the status quo. And in these spaces that are really marked by very unequal power balances of power, and it's the Brubaker has this emphatic sort of postulation that it's in these situations cooperation and co-optation are nearly indistinguishable. Okay, and then we have the invented spaces. It's about opposed to the invited organizational spaces, ideally sort of autonomous, built by social movement themselves, and they are claimed by their collective action. So these are sites for what, for example, several of these authors call counter, with a reference to Gramsci, counter-hegemonic practices, in order to expose, make clear, make evident, and upset normalized relations of dominance. They, in other words, they launch a war of position. They do that, I mean, by having this original space where they consolidate their collaboration and do the analysis and I mean, go together with allies. But in order to, but if they just stayed outside, they could be powerless. They could stand and scream on the street or something like that, or their analysis would not be read. So in order to achieve influence, movements like this may actually oscillate between invented and invited spaces. But again, involvement in this participatory development of government, they are sort of both outside and inside, as Stefan has argued, some of them. It may again result in appropriation and depoliticization. So the space that we have mainly, and the process that we have been concentrated on in our work is what started with the so-called high-level dialogue, the UN high-level dialogue on migration. After long debates, they took a grand step there on migration in 2006, and the outcome was not a direct UN process, but instituting an intergovernmental forum that has the name of the Global Forum for Migration and Development, meeting with governments from all over the world, meeting every year since 2007, and discussing terms for how migration should be developed, policies and politics on that. And then it became also a space where, but quite soon, civil society was invited to participate. And we have followed this process since then, 2006, and all the years. I think Stefan participated in almost all of them, except for maybe one of them in Brussels, he says. And until the global compact was signed, agreed by governments, not all of them, in 2018. And one important meeting that I participated in, for example, was in Mexico City in 2010. It was quite an impressive event. I mean, it was the global gathering of the so-called People's Global Action on Migration, Development and Human Rights, and it took place in Mexico City, and it was parallel to that year's global forum. That's this one. On migration and development that took place in another Mexican city the same year. And the intention was to feed claims and analysis into the global forum, the space for discussion with civil society, and they got a few delegates in there actually at that time. But it was quite a radical sort of. It was impressive in the sense it was about 1,000 delegates from all over the world, and they, except for China and Russia maybe. So, but they're sort of outside the system. There were migrant organizations and federations from all over most of the world, and there were unions, global and local unions, and there were advocacy organizations, etc., faith-based organizations. It was huge, and there were fantastic discussions and fantastic analysis presented at that. Actually, which is very important, the financing of the event was quite. It was a part, which was not part of the Global Forum for Migration and Development. Was not. It was independent of that. And they actually appealed for decommodifying human rights-based governance of migration, where it sort of echoes Karl Polanyi's great transformation about. I mean, we are not a commodity. Our labor, our lives are destroyed by one-sided market sort of being commodified. So they speak about decent work and social protection, and they're very much in line with the ILO that actually argued for a decommodification of labor in general, and not least for migrant labor. So here's a sort of outside-inside distinction that Stefan is talking about, and the PGA, the People's Global Action for Migration and Development, also this one, followed a very clear sort of outside-inside strategy. They were having their own meetings, and they were quite impressive, at least at an early stage. And then they would feed into this invited space. There's a civil society there was an integral part of these meetings of the Global Forum for Migration and Development. It's an intergovernmental meeting. But these people were screened by, there was a strong influence on who could come and not come from the, partly by the governments organizing the meetings, and partly by other actors, intergovernmental actors. So, and by the financiers of the Global Forum for Migration and Development. So, and then from participating in this space, civil society days, the invited space, they could go on and participate even in the common space. And there would be one day where civil society, the screened civil society, and delegates from outside, the inside sort of organizations would meet. And then there would be a common space where civil society could meet governments. But there's also, and Stefan has made quite interesting studies about that, organizations like the International Migrants Alliance that didn't accept that system or that strategy, and sort of here GFMD, the Global Forum for Migration and Development, is your vision, but it is our slavery. So they talk about cooptation, about depoliticization, and all of these things. Okay. There's a very interesting study by Georgi from 2010, actually, so it's a bit outdated maybe, but it sets up kind of a game plan, or whatever you would call it, about what are at stake in these meetings in terms of approaches to global governance of migration. The dominant one here, I guess, would be the national sovereignty perspective. And there would be an interest in sharing best practices, and there would be an interest in informal collaboration between governments. But the stress would be on the continued centrality of nation-states and their power to determine entry, stay, and removal on non-citizens. And this perspective would be definitely opposed to any binding international global framework on migration. And then there's a right-based approach, and that would be about these conventions, about the whole range of conventions on both labor rights, human rights, and migrant rights that are actually binding, but they're not signed by everybody. And the idea here would to be to make them more general, to force governments to sign them, to make them into general instruments for regulating migration. It would privilege the rights of workers, migrants, and refugees over the interest in a technocratic scheme for global management of migration. They would be supported, this perspective, by CSOs and NGOs, especially the critical ones of them, and also of factions within intergovernmental organizations like especially the ILO, but also UNHCR and UNDP. And that would be then finally approach to the also the neoliberal approach, and which would be also interested in effectively binding treaty-based supranational regime within firm frameworks of migration management. But it would be very much about the economic benefits of migrants to the countries of destination, and it would be very much about restrictive border controls and effective deportation systems, and the prime protagonist would be the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. So anyway, here we introduce another concept, which we concept by Marc Purcell, which he calls the network of equivalence. He describes this as an articulation of differentiated but equivalent popular struggles. I mean, you have the unions and you have the faith-based organizations, you have the migrant organizations, and they all have somewhat different perspectives, but they need to find, and they have to accept each other's positions in some way, go into a dialogue. They need to accept that the political field is irreducibly plural, but at the same time merging their sameness, where they have sameness, they have some have important common goals and the differences in terms of a common identity and a strong agenda. So it comes very close to you are referring to this transversal, we could call it transversal cosmopolitanism. It's about and that has directly refers to the global governance theme. It's about finding a common ground for dialogue, collective learning, progressive hybridization. I mean, how do we merge our perspectives? And political cooperation is much like this network of equivalence. I mean, in order to create powerful transformative movements. What we find in some of the analysis that we did, particularly important here in terms of transversal solidarity, that is the often conflictive bond between, on the one hand, the civic rights and migrants organization, faith-based organization, etc. They're more interested in the broad framework of citizenship and human rights, and sometimes they're focused very much just on identity, but that's not so common anyway. And the trade unions that tend to focus on more privileged groups of workers, and they're so concerned about work organization, etc. But there are different versions of it. So I mean, the trade unions should be more in a situation where they would be concerned about a broader livelihoods of the people, I mean migrants, and their communities and the conditions, and not just bread and butter issues of the more privileged. They could easier forge a strong relationship with the other, with the civil rights movements, etc. And those, in turn, are more evident partners to the trade unions, and it's also very, very important for this process in general, if they, with a strong focus of labor rights as human rights. That's kind of, but it's at least it's a key to I mean, it's a key moment in these processes of forming strong networks of equivalence or transversal solidarities. So, in this long range or this long row of meetings that taking place from 2006 and onwards, at least in some of the parts that I was working with, we found the New York high-level dialogue. From this high-level dialogue that started off the process in 2006, the process about global governance came back from the intergovernmental sort of events, yearly events, back to the UN again in 2030. And we see this meeting where also the governments were participating, and as both the climate and the deep battle for civil society. And on the one hand, there has been enormous efforts into creating a strong platform, the Global Coalition on Migration. I don't remember when it was formed, I think it was 2011, and they did an enormous, I mean, it consisted of regional, international networks of migrant associations, migrant rights organizations, trade unions, etc., and independent people from academia. And they did great work to mobilize. I mean, it's based on these processes of mobilization, both within the People's Global Action, but also fora, such as the World Social Forum on Migration for many years, but intensified the year before the New York meeting. It had a lot of consultations with intergovernmental organizations and regional actors in the migration field. And actually, the agenda is quite radical if you think about what is actually going on the ground. It's about tackling the ground causes of development and making migration a choice, not a necessity. I mean, we should not be forced to be here because you are there anymore. And then it's about engaging migrants and diasporas as genuine partners. It's about women's rights. It's about also, actually, which is extremely important, to implement in national legislation the full range of provisions in all this plethora of international conventions that are actually binding for those that sign them. It should be about, which is a radical claim, I mean, but a perfectly just one, actually institute a mechanism to guarantee labor rights for migrant workers equal to the rights of natives. Once you work, and you also, it includes also the right to organize, for example. But at the same time, the New York high-level dialogue was seen in practice as a scene of exclusion of civil society, the few were allowed to speak on the scene, but more as tokens of the process than actually being able to strongly influence the process. What happened was that at that time the whole discourse of human rights was adopted across the board, more or less, even by the most human rights sort of abusers among the. So it became kind of a universal language, but the civil society was sort of confused. What does that actually mean? Does it mean recognition or pacification through appropriation, through cooptation? And the trade unions were furious in terms of how they were treated at that time, and it sort of became their a kind of prelude to their partially withdrawing from the process, which also became evident in the following DFMD meetings in, for example, Stockholm and Istanbul. We talked to Stockholm unions. They were cross. They were angry. They were really felt so run over. And it was also a conservative government in Sweden that organized the whole process. So there's a parallel to this. I mean, speaking, I have a problem with this. Parallel to this, something is happening which has been in the cards for a long time, but now it becomes more evident. Like the ILO, which is a protagonist, the most pronounced protagonist of the rights-based approach, especially with its decent work agenda, is sort of the composite politics for instituting a social dimension of globalization is increasingly derailed from the whole process. And they have all of these declarations and conventions, ILO conventions, and what they wanted to actually make binding. And then in favor of the IOM and its concept of managed migration. And there's this very strong critique of the IOM. It has a discourse or approach, has a neoliberal agenda with politics of migration transformed into an apolitical migration management, seemingly apolitical, where migration is presented as a technical problem and not as a political topic. It's driven by apolitical managerial values of efficiency, etc. And it's very much also an approach that sort of works towards the cooptation of civil society, among other, by channeling their financing from the meetings of, for example, the People Global Action for Migration and Development, which took place in Stockholm. The people that could come to Stockholm were financed by the same organization close to the IOM that financed the sort of civil society screened participation in the civil society days, the spaces for discussion, deliberation with governments. So it's according to this analysis, it's an approach on the one hand speaking the language of migrant rights, on the other hand serving the industrialized countries in what here is described as the bitter reality of migration, and the rich countries are actually the greatest financiers, are those who finance most of IOM's activities, operational, sort of basic budget. Okay. What happens is then a derailing of the rights-based approach, Sorry? It's all right?
Let's wrap up.
Sorry?
The time is up.
Yeah. And this whole process we see as reflected in the Global Compact, the CGM, the Global Compact on Migration, which has been analyzed, and we argue is void of references to this very important basic convention on the protection of the rights of all migrant workers and their families, maybe the most important of all of these conventions. And it's almost very little reference to labor standards. It's absolutely not binding, and their rights for organizing of migrant workers. So, and what does this boil down to? There's still a democratic parlance of participation, but it is, according to a former specialist of the ILO, Patrick Taran, boiling down to a radical regime change, this non-binding character of the Global Compact and its neoliberal sort of orientation towards migration management is changing away from binding global normative system of rights, especially labor rights, and becomes a non-binding declarative instrument about migration management and an agenda for arbitrary executive authority. So a kind of collusion, because it's not binding of the national approach and the neoliberal approach somehow in that another. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much. I hope I didn't rush you at the end. Maybe just a brief comment that with your conclusion that actually the Global Compact on Migration is just a declarative instrument. Czech Republic was among the countries opposing the compact, and I think at the end they absented from the vote. I just prepared a couple comments for your presentation, mainly on this broader framework of political economy of global capitalism and the risks of cooptation. Mm. So I just have to read it myself. I think both morning presentations actually illustrated this embeddedness of transnational migration within the dynamics of global economy, which is a key for formulating, an understanding of which is a key for formulating a response to transnational migration. Well, we all see how migration is sparkling quite a vivid public and political debates, but in speaking from the EU context, it is symptomatic that these debates concentrate predominantly on migrants coming to high-income countries or the humanitarian relief responses to the basic or urgent needs of refugees. So on the one hand, migrants who stay outside the EU gates don't represent the migration crisis, so-called migration crisis. On the other hand, structural causes of migration are to a large extent omitted in the debate, as it was also shown in Professor Schierup's presentation. So, and this was also tellingly manifested in the rebranding of migration crisis as refugee crisis, mobilizing mainly moral arguments and calling for compassion without any systemic changes of the structures producing forced migration. So the both global compacts on migration and for refugees actually use, while they use a strong human rights language, the reasoning behind is to control and significantly reduce migration, as you pointed out. And they also reiterate the strict separation of refugees and migrants, especially so-called economic migrants. Economic migration is depoliticized as an isolated problem of either individuals or states, and which needs to be controlled and managed. And in the European context especially, economic migration is symbolically represented by a figure of poor African migrant who comes to Europe in search for a better life. Moreover, who can or cannot qualify as refugee is subject to politically motivated designation of a country of origin as safe, which then move these migrants to a category of an economic migration. As recently, for example, Eritrea has been characterized by several countries as improving and less dangerous, which means which makes possible to reduce the number of granted asylum. Mm. So, as you pointed out, understanding transnational migration in the context of global political economy problematizes this distinction and shows how the so-called economic migration is a form of forced migration as well, as Raul Delgado Weiss argued in your book. So poverty, economic underdevelopment, and civil conflicts and wars, which spark displacement and migration, are often falsely interpreted as if they are exclusively the result of internal state dynamics and local ethnic conflicts. Again, quite often applied to different African conflicts. However, causes of such economic and political conflicts are historically embedded in global geopolitics, a colonial past, but also the geopolitics of the Cold War and the consecutive war on terror, and they are exacerbated within today's global capitalism. Alison Ayers, who analyzed the case of Sudan, argues, for example, that the concept of civil war itself is not only ideologically convenient, because it obfuscates transnational responsibilities of other state and non-state actors, but it is also conceptually inadequate, based on a naturalized idea of the state, which considers conflict only as defined by territorial boundaries. So as a result of this false understanding of different kinds of conflicts as an exclusive internal state matter, the economic and social reasons are not regarded as legitimate reasons for migration. Under these circumstances, then, the only legitimate discursive framework for promoting protection of migrants' rights is a moral discourse, which runs the risk of depoliticizing cooptation, as Professor Schierup actually showed in the chapter in his book, which he showed at the beginning. So today, the agenda of refugee protection is defensive, maintaining the problematic distinction between political refugees and economic migrants in order to preserve the limited protection of refugees, which is now recognized in the international legal order. But this pragmatic strategy carries risks of cooptation, not only the risks of promoting protection of refugees by reproducing exclusion of a large number of migrants under the bracket of economic migrants, but also, as Branka Likic-Barboric argued, the risk of neoliberal reframing of migrant protection that actually brings about a business-run model finding a niche on transnational labor market for refugees and thus repositioning them as weakly protective labor migrants. Well, I think that it's actually important to challenge this strict separation between refugees and economic migrants, because it makes possible to move beyond this limited moral discourse of human rights of migrants and to center debate on global structural injustice and extraterritorial responsibilities of state and non-state actors, including those involved indirectly through chains of actions and social relations, leading to unintended consequences, harming others in distant places. So at this point, I think it's important also to question this pragmatic strategy of the dominance of the society actors. This interpretation of the international assistance for countries hosting migrants and refugees as a benevolent act based on these moral obligations rather than responsibility based on actions and negative impacts of state powers and transnational corporations domiciled in their territories not only gives wealthy countries control over the global management of migration beyond their borders, but also contributes to reproducing unequal relations between international and local NGOs and civil society actors. So, and these international NGOs, based mainly in Western countries, then have a much stronger influence on these global migration fora. So this inequality is then translated also to, well, there's a lot of discussions actually focusing on how these inequalities are manifested in local contexts among NGOs assisting migrants, but it is also translated to the global levels. Branka Likic-Prigovic, again, from my colleague Professor Schierup, shows how the original focus on UN fora from the 90s on root causes and the right not to migrate was narrowed to technical and depoliticized approach of economic mobility responding to market demands, which is mainly temporary and circular labor migration, and migration management relying on securitization, militarization, and outsourcing of border controls defined by the interest of the receiving wealthy states. Recently, the EU has been turning its attention to outsourcing its border controls to some African countries in order to, again, manage migration from Africa through bilateral agreements, the involvement of private companies, and strategies of exchanging development aid for migration control, which is all part of this neoliberal restructuring of the migration discourse. In the upcoming EU budget period, 2021 till 27, there is a tendency to divert part of development resources to securitization and militarization of border controls and to condition investments and development cooperation by migration management. But the situation of many contemporary migrants shows the systemic violation of their human rights and international law. In practice, what we see today is a deterioration of the human rights regime as a result of the externalization of so-called border management. So borders become space for the violation of rights which the states try to avoid by externalization and outsourcing of border control. And these, Julia Schultz-Wessel argues that in these externalized border zones, migrants become the rightless persons in the sense Hannah Arendt described, despite the development of the international protection of refugees since the Second World War. So my comments were actually from a bit of different angle, but coming to the similar conclusion that we can see this as an argument that despite a seemingly pragmatic choice to play along this distinction between refugees and economic migrants in these strategies in order to preserve the current international protection of refugees, it leads to a cooptation and spiraling effect of deterioration of the protection of refugees as well, which is the sort of result how the emerging global governance now is unfolding. So this was my comments to your presentation. Thank you again, and now we can open space for the discussion. Or if you want to have a comment before they
it's just,
think of
I think it's important what you say, and it's partly about this but only partly about this humanitarian sort of discourse on moral discourse on refugees. But it's also about something else. It's about actually making refugees live under a similar regime as labor migrants, or even much more exposed. I mean, Khalid Kosa talks about coming from the frying pan into the fire in the informal economy. But in Sweden, we have it's an approach that is sort of coming close to the temporary sort of managed migration concept, like from a completely different perspective. Refugees would immediately get full citizenship. We have come into a situation where of temporary protection, but that protection is very much. I mean, you can get a residence permit of 11 months, but to having it renewed is very much dependent on that you can prove your employability. That's a really important phrase. You are individually responsible for proving your worth as in terms of human capital. I mean, and that you are employable, and a prolongation of your stay, your residence permit might be dependent on that. And then afterwards also, if you later on, if you can take your family with you or not. So actually, at the same time as moral discourse persists, and it's merging with the employability discourse and the whole regime of circular migration or temporary migration.
Please, Anna.
Yeah, I just want to say exactly that point that you're making now about refugees being turned, from the morality of it or the normative principles into economic agents is exactly what I was pointing out in terms of the family, and the two are not an accident that they're the same kind of drivers, because exactly that refuge, in order to get a more secure status, it's no longer that you get that straight away, but you have to prove yourself. So in a sense, we've also got this whole probationary period. And that feeds into the temporary regime that has also been increasingly promulgated in relation to, in terms of settler societies, where we now have more temporary migration than we do have permanent to start with. So all of these neoliberal izations of regulation, I think, kind of compound each other.
I see this as a comment, but just a little comment to that. I mean, in the Swedish situation, it's very interesting. I mean, there was this system of temporary labor migration instituted in 2008, which was a kind of revolution in Sweden, turning all that was before on its head. But at least formally, these labor migrants, their work conditions should comply with the collective agreements between capital and labor in Sweden, which is very, very important in the Swedish labor market. But it doesn't apply to the about labor, about wages, etc., and working conditions, security, and so on. But it doesn't apply to refugees, the collective agreements. So even if they have to prove their employability, they have in our context they have less of a their status, their lives are less protected, their livelihoods are less protected than for the labor migrants. There's also a lot of abuse there, but anyway.
Maybe if I could ask, is it like that the labor migrants are really protected? Because what's happening in the Czech Republic is that there is that the border or the line between what this looks like legal and what the system legalizes is actually, according to many of us, like modern slavery. Like actually, for example, the Czech Republic introduced the so-called system of short-term labor visa, and people can come here for 3 months and work here, and usually they don't get the first salary for the first month because they need to pay like all the costs of living and everything. Then they receive the second one, and then they are supposed to leave after 3 months, and they do not receive the third salary. So, and this is like a trend which is happening, from my opinion, everywhere. So everyone knows that this is happening, but it seems to be illegal. According to the labor code, they should have all the rights, but actually they don't have. So this is something that has always been part of economic migration to a certain extent, but what concerns me is that the line between what seems to be legal and what is illegal is just becoming, or what is against the law and the labor code especially, is becoming really blurred and very, very close. So we are just the categories which should be quite obvious do not work in reality from my perspective. Yeah. So I think that this is something part of what's really difficult to tackle, because the world or the state expect and treat categories which seem to work, but actually they do not work or cannot work.
I just agree with you. I mean, exactly the same is the case in Sweden in many times. I mean, it's about what is formally regulated and what happens in reality. And the problem is very much that it's so dangerous for these people to organize to claim their rights because they are temporary. And the unions and other have very, the conditions in the labor market are so badly controlled.
So maybe if I may just to bring the discussion back to the idea of cooptation. So if these strategies of, like pragmatic playing alone seem to lead to actually this depoliticized, very much in line of neoliberal approach, neoliberal approach to migration, then what kind of possibilities do you see for these transversal solidarities or transversal cosmopolitanism now?
Well, I think I had that in the conclusion here, maybe. Right, yeah. What would be the conclusion then? Okay. There's this limited influence in the context of existing invited spaces. There's this risk of appropriation, etc. But this poses a need to continually critically recreate and consolidate movements on invited spaces, and to develop a sustainable capacity as political subjects. And to some degree, this is actually happening. I mean, the later meetings of the People's Global Action for Migration, Development and Human Rights, the PTA, had a more radical character than the previous meetings in, for example, Stockholm and Turkey, that were very weak and where they felt very, very co-opted, and there was and I think it has very much to do with the financing. To the meetings in Stockholm in 2014 and later in Istanbul, these meetings were so dependent on financing sources very close to IOM and the minus migration approach, while the meetings in Germany in 2017 and later on in Marrakesh had a more independent financing, not directly connected with the intergovernmental process. And the IOM came from Friedrich Ebert. Stiftung was a very important financer, and it gave a leeway, a breathing room for more critical discussion and development of alternative strategies. And then you have also, of course, other fora, like the World Social Forum, that could be a potential alternative in the public space. And I was in Mexico City last year, the latest World Social Forum on Migrations meeting, and there were several ideas of really not making them single events, but having, making them platform for continuous work between these meetings and mobilizing global networks locally and nationally and on the city level. So, I don't know, kind of answer.
Thank you. The time is up. Thank you for the presentation and the discussion.